November 1st, 2016. Darling, I made it to Iraq. The goal I set 15 years ago as a young kid in the wake of 9/11 has been realized. So far, my tour has consisted of 4 plane rides, 5 bus rides, countless miles of lugging my gear, 1 Monopoly win, 1 Monopoly loss, and 4 days at a transit way station awaiting further movement to my duty station. I was in Kuwait in 2014, 2015, and I was a platoon leader for that deployment. And then I was in Iraq. I was only there for 2017 because of my son's birth, but over there I worked with the division staff, and I did key leader engagements for visitors coming into Iraq.
I feel like Ryan and I are not totally typical when it comes to spouses in the military.
I think we Skyped on that first deployment twice.
Yeah.
And other than that, we wrote letters and journaled and stuff like that. Yeah.
I think a lot of people probably talk a lot more than we did, but sometimes we would go weeks where he was just really busy and I was really busy and the time difference was kind of crazy.
It got too complicated trying to get a hold of my son. He was only about 4 at the time, and you know, when I'd call, he'd already be in bed, or he hadn't woke up yet, or he was already at school, or I always would miss him, and then he was only 4, so he would get on the phone for 2 seconds and then run off and play, and it took me all day to arrange this one phone call. And then the phone call would be very dramatic. He'd cry, I'd cry, we would just both be a mess. So then I switched to letters and postcards. This is actually one of the postcards that I had sent him. I got this at the PX on one of the missions that I did. They had a little PX set up, and they had postcards. So then I just started sending him letters instead of trying to arrange the phone calls because it got too stressful on both ends.
Writing home was so important for the soldiers. It gave them a way to connect with people they loved and cared about at home, and vice versa. You know, the people at home were waiting anxiously for any word that their loved one was safe. And the soldier, always, you see in the letters, you know, I received your letter, or I only got 1 letter, are there more, or why haven't you written? So it's so important, this connection.
Care packages are incredibly popular. My parents sent us multiple, and we would send them back and forth to each other. Mm-hmm. One thing we would include in that is a book of mandalas. And what we would do is we would color in a mandala, and then we would write a note in there. She was a much better colorist than I was.
In his defense, I work with kids like a lot, and I was working with kids then too. I get way more practice coloring than you do.
Yeah, that's true. I don't get a lot of reps in anymore, not since, 3rd grade.
When I look back on it now, it was almost like journaling. Like my husband was my real-time diary, you know, and so I would write to him they would seem so meaningless, like, hey, today, you know, I went to Pizza Hut, and then we drove to this fob, and then we went to this fob, and, you know, there was no encounter of anything, and then we came home. It's just kind of funny to think back to that time. Like, some of the things would say, you know, I haven't heard from you. It says you're logged in Messenger, but I can't get a hold of you. Is everything okay? And then this one was kind of funny. It said, today was the most fun day that I've had in a while. We actually had Pizza Hut, and it made my day. And I thought that was really funny that, you know, Pizza Hut made my day, and I was just elated. I'm like, oh my gosh, I had Pizza Hut. And then his response was like, I am so happy you had Pizza Hut. That's so awesome. And it's just, you don't realize how much you take the little things for granted when you're home. But then when you read these emails, it puts things into perspective. Like, wow, we have it good. You know, things could be a lot harder. They could be a lot worse.
I joined the Army in 2000, and I was a diesel mechanic, all-wheel vehicle diesel mechanic and recovery specialist. He got orders for Iraq, so he went first. At this point, we had a daughter, and she was 1. I didn't answer the door for the entire year he was gone. We had this really long walkway to the house. But I would never answer the door. I wouldn't even go to if I didn't know you were coming, I would never answer the door because I was always so afraid that there would be two people on the other side in Class A's.
There was a situation where we had an incident and we had to turn in all of our cell phones and shut down all communication for a week because there was a threat. So I wasn't able to warn anyone or email anyone and say, hey, I won't be able to talk to you. So here I was emailing, virtually every day, and then all of a sudden communication just stopped. And so then your mind goes crazy, like, well, what's going on? And with letters, you wouldn't have got that in the moment. So I think it's bittersweet.
When a telegram was sent, the telegraph operator would type up what was being sent, the message. They would cut it and paste it onto these little slips of paper to be sent to the person at the other end. Back then, it was one of the main ways that the military communicated with the parents of a soldier. And in this case, these telegrams were sent to Graham Skank's mom and dad back here in Dayton, Ohio. And they're very interesting and they're heart-wrenching. Some of them are just heart-wrenching because they first report Graham as being missing in action. Then they followed up with an official letter from the Major General writing to Mr. Skank saying, we regretfully inform you that your son has been reported missing in action in Belgium since December 18th, 1944. And this is a typewritten letter, of course. The general talks about in the letter how difficult it is under war conditions to locate an individual and let them know where he is. And then you see another telegram and with the news that he's been captured. He's a prisoner of war in a German POW camp. Finally, you see letters from Skank from the prison camp. He tells her to go to either a local military office or the library to get help in translating so that she understands where he's writing from. So that must have been very difficult for her to get this in the mail and not be able to read the outside of it. But to open it up and actually have a letter from your son who's a POW. In these letters from the POW camp, he's pretty straightforward with his mom about what's happening, but he also tells her when he knows that he's going to be liberated, and right after he's liberated, he tells her in a letter, I will tell you so many stories when I get home because I can't put it all down on paper right now.
All I can say is it just seems wonderful, and I love you very much. And we always discuss you, and honey, just because I don't write to you doesn't mean that I don't think about you, because you're one person that's on my mind always.
My name is Anthony Massoud. I was in the Army, artillery, and I was an advisor in Vietnam, and I was ROTC, and I was commissioned January of 1964, and I served 3.5 years. We communicated with pen and pencil, paper, walkie-talkie to the States, and then landline, and then tapes, those reel-to-reel pocket tapes.
Boy, you had a nice write-up in the paper about you in Vietnam, and I tore the clipping out and I put it on my fireplace. As soon as I get a chance, I'm going downtown and buy a frame and put it in a frame. My insurance man came over. Anybody that comes over, I show them your picture, and I say, look at my cousin Sonny. I'm down at your mother's house right now, and Tootsie and all of them are sitting around the table making me laugh, and I don't... and I get all mixed up. I don't know what to say to you, because every time I look at Tootsie, her eyes look like they're ready to, she's ready to cry. God bless you, honey, and take good care of yourself. Your mother and all of them are around here, and they all say hello.
Hello, honey. I
Hello,
love you,
baby.
dear.
God bless you. What do you think about the tape?
I think the tape is wonderful. It's like talking on the phone to him. Hi, Tony. This is your sister, Shirley. I miss you very much, very much. I think
Whenever I got something for the first time that was a positive, it was a good feeling. It was like a surprise. You know, you don't expect it, and it's there. And I love getting the tapes from my parents and friends, and that was really meaningful because it's like I'm sitting across from you, except my eyes are closed.
We have this misconception with technology that it's easier, and it's actually more frustrating because you're you know, it doesn't always work. There's that disconnect. You know, me and my husband would be mid-conversation, and the internet would go down, and then it wouldn't be up for days, and it almost is taunting you, you know, like, well, we kind of have this technology, you just can't use it all the time, it's going to fail a lot, so you're not really going to get to talk that often. And I think that's where my letdown happened with my deployment, is I had thought in my head, internet, man, it should be a breeze to just call home or email home and get an email back, and it should be no problem. And it was a lot more frustrating than that. Whereas with letters, you know, I would, you know, probably write a letter every single day, send one every single day, and then you could put them together in a timeline and still put yourself in that real life moment if you follow the timeline. Obviously, you know, it'd be in the past, by the time they read these letters, it could be a month or two old before they actually get them, but once they did, they could put it together and see where I was at in that time.
29th of July, 2014, Nene. Babe, Blackhawks are amazing. Private Scott's re-enlistment was amazing as well, and went off with only one hitch. I messed up the oath. I'm an idiot when I'm nervous, but it was a success. Additionally, we became a minor viral video. Last I checked, we had 12,000 views on Facebook. I'll leave you an autograph at the end of my letter.
People today need to hear these stories from not just the Civil War, World War I, World War II. There are still stories to be told from servicemen.
When it came time for me to go, I was for it. I wanted to go, and he was just like, you don't have to, please don't. And I was like, no, you got the opportunity to serve. You went over there, you did what you had to do. I need that too. I need to feel like I'm protecting this land that I love for my child so she can grow up in this free world. Because I had seen how she was with him, I knew what to kind of expect. But I thought in my head, for some reason, our bond would be better because I'm her mom and I breastfed her and she's close to my heart. It wasn't. It was still just as, I guess, painful. We ended up being apart for 3 years, and he would send me VHS tapes, and I had to procure a VCR, which was not easy, of what she was watching, and then he would record her also and put her on there. And she loved to sing, and so I have VHS tapes of her singing and jumping on the bed and bossing people around. No idea where she got that from. And the show High Five, she really liked that show. So I would watch the show and be able to talk about the characters, or at least try to engage her for as long as I could get her to stay on the phone before she was off to the next thing. By the time you get the picture, or by the time I got the video, it was on to the next show. It was on to the next thing. It was on to the next outfit. I was always 2 months behind, 6 weeks behind.
Hello and welcome to the first installment of Veteran Voices, Lives and Stories series. My name is Seth Gordon. I'm the director of the Veteran and Military Center at Wright State University. We are streaming from the New Media Incubator in the basement of the Wright Dunbar Library. And I want to take some time to recognize our supporters and those who made this series possible. This program is made possible in part by Ohio Humanities, a state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this short film and on this panel discussion do not necessarily represent those of the National Endowment for the Humanities. I want to take some time to acknowledge a few people who made this possible. First, the entire series arc was presented by Navy and Air Force student veteran Jeremy Tack. Thank you, Jeremy. Also, I want to acknowledge one of our panelists, Erica Carter, one of the producers of the series, and the Veteran Voices project coordinator for all of her support and advice in moving these films forward. Second, none of this would be possible without the support of many offices at Wright State, including the Division of Student Success, Research and Sponsored Programs, the Office of Equity and Inclusion, and the College of Liberal Arts, in particular the English Department and the Communications Department. I want to give special thanks to Dr. Ashley Hall and Dr. Jen Ware, who co-direct the New Media Incubator and served as executive producers on the project and have been responsible for coordinating much of the student effort that has gone into making this project a reality. Thank you very much. So let's get started. So why don't we have our panelists introduce themselves by sharing their names, if you were in the military, what you did, and what your role is either in Wright State or on this panel. So we'll start here and move down.
My name is Erica Carter. I was in the Army. I was an all-wheel vehicle mechanic and a recovery specialist. At Wright State, I am a student, and I am the Veterans Voices coordinator.
My name is Logan Young, and I was in the Army as well. And I was a truck driver and the lead convoy driver for my deployment. And I am a graduate assistant here at Wright State.
My name is Dawn Dewey, and I was not in the military, but here at Wright State, I'm head of the Special Collections and Archives Department and have the privilege of taking care of all of the letters and diaries and things of our servicemen and women.
My name is Ryan Lay. I was in the Army for 5 years. I was an infantry officer and a military intelligence officer. And at Wright State, I work for the IT department, classroom tech.
I'm Courtney Lay. I am Ryan's wife. I was not in the military, but I am currently a student at Wright State as well.
Great. So what memories did watching this film bring back for each of you? Whoever wants to start.
All right, well, I can start. I've always liked writing. It's something I've always enjoyed doing. And I think the thing that you usually lack when you're trying to get into writing is purpose. And so I really, hearing myself read journal entries from that time period brings back how much I enjoyed it and how it felt really nice to do something like that for Courtney that she could then look back on. So that's really cheesy, but that's what it brings back for me.
Mine is a little bit more ominous. So for me, it makes me think of how frustrating everything was being apart from my family, in particular my husband, who was trying to go through basic training and everything while I was deployed, and then my son, who was only 4 at the time, and just how little I really got to speak with him and share things with him and things that I received from him. There just wasn't a lot of communication. He was so little.
I think for me, it brings back a lot of fond memories and not so fond memories, because a lot of heartache comes from deployments, but I can reflect back on how much I've grown because of it, and I can appreciate that.
So the first opening where Ryan's reading that letter, he had just gone to Iraq, was actually, he was only in Iraq for probably, 3 months, 4 months, not
very long before our son was born. And so immediately he starts reading that, and I remember how tough it was for him to get to his duty station. And then almost right away it was like, oh, Sam's here. Come on back home. Or no, not Sam, Elliot. Elliot was, yeah. So it's kind of interesting. But it brought back memories of having my first kid, so.
I think for me, as a non-veteran and working in the archives, it makes me think about how important it is for us to hang on to these stories, the letters, the tapes, the films, the postcards, the colored pictures, whatever it is. These are stories that help teach those of us who did not serve, brings us a little closer to what it must have been like for people in the military. And another thing it reminds me of is that there are so many similarities between the importance of communication, no matter if it's the Civil War or if it's today. The same emotions are there. And I just think it's so important, and this experience for me has brought home how important it is to save these stories and share them.
So that's a good segue into our next question, which is about, like for instance, Ryan and Courtney, your exchange is extremely, at least from what I've heard, very unique. And maybe did you know other people that did things like that?
I had one friend in the military, and he was coincidentally my roommate, and he wrote letters a lot. And I think that was one thing that we actually bonded over. But other than him, it was not very common in my experience in either of my deployments to see people writing letters. I think it was just too easy to either do no contact or, use electronic media to. So in watching the
film, though, we saw somebody from Vietnam, we heard some letters from World War II. Were there, for those of you that were serving, were there did you feel connections to those people? I think, Dawn, you were alluding to that it's, my time working with veterans and definitely hearing the stories that Erica gathers in the Veteran Voices Project, we see that there's a real immediate connection even between eras, like World War II vets and Vietnam vets and, post 9/11 vets. You all kind of get it. But so did you see those connections and hearing the stories from different eras in that film?
Definitely, I did. I'm a huge documentary fan, and Ken Burns has very famous Civil War documentaries. In one of them, they do a dramatic reading of a letter from a major named Sullivan Ballou, and that always stuck with me. It's very poetic, and when we were dating, I think I showed Courtney that, and I was just like, isn't this amazing? You show people videos, and you're like, yeah, look at this, great. And that was something that I always felt some affinity towards, and I don't want to recreate it because there's no way I'm going to be that level of poetic, but having that kind of a thing to look back on is nice, and I felt a connection there for sure.
I felt a connection between Logan and I, not that we hadn't previously talked about it being battles, but it's really nice to know that somebody else was going through some of the struggles and hardships of, trying to get your 3-year-old to sit down and stay with you on the phone, and then at some point maybe having to accept that might not happen. Let me find an alternate way to try to stay in contact, and that the postal system is what it's consistent. It's consistent versus some technologies. You'll get a letter eventually. You will get that letter. So I think that was really nice and comforting, that it has transcended time.
The connection I saw was that as well with the children, and trying to communicate with small kids on a deployment is next to impossible. But with Ryan, just giving up and going old school and writing letters because technology is so difficult. It, like I said in the film, it seems easy, but it's really not. It's almost like a fantasy. It's, you have this appeal like, oh, the internet, and I can just immediate connection, and that's not how it works. So if anything, it's more of a letdown. And then you almost want to just resort back to letters because it just seems easier. You can get it down in the moment. However, me being a truck driver, I was never able to sit down and write. So for me, it was even more frustrating because I had thought that multiple times, if I could just get this on paper before I forget or before the week passes, because, you know, a week would pass and I'd forget what even happened and I hadn't talked to anybody and it just went by so fast. So that was the connection I made, that I saw that frustration, you know, across generations, even with the videotapes or the audio tapes, trying to talk in almost real time, but it's just not possible. So
I want to dig a little bit deeper into that. I've heard from several veterans that, and I'm curious, Courtney, very specifically, because you mentioned that you got to talk to Ryan once or twice, and if there was a difference between the letters and how that made you feel and the immediate talking to him while he was there. We've heard the technology and the speed of everything, right? The speed of getting home a day, I mean, even from people in Vietnam. I'm in Vietnam one day, I'm home a day later, as opposed to the World War II veterans that had months of travel backwards. And sometimes that seemed to help them decompress and make sense of what they had done, just because they had time, they had to spend time with other vets. And you know, this is a really immediate transition, especially due to technology. You're talking to him or you're talking to her, and then the next minute you're back in this space. So was that good or bad? I don't know if that's the right way to ask it, but can you talk about it?
It was hard. So going from, and we only Skyped like twice, but because we only Skyped maybe 2 times that whole deployment, we both like looked really different too. And so you go from reading these letters and, you know, you're able to take your time and talk about everything you want, but also when we Skyped, I felt rushed. Like, oh, I've got to tell you everything that's happening right now. And also sometimes he couldn't stay on very long. And so he'd be like, oh, gotta go. And then of course we cut that communication off and we're like, what's happening? Why do you have to go so fast? So it was hard. I definitely preferred writing. So, yeah.
How did you feel, Ryan, about those times when you were there after? Was there a difference?
I think Courtney hit the nail on the head, honestly. Like, I think that you have a lot more time to edit and think of how you want to say something. You can be a little more pensive, and there's that lends something to effective communication, being able to sit and think about it like that. And when you're in a video chat, you might forget to say certain things, or you wanted to talk about certain things. Oh yeah, I forgot about that, and you have to remember next time, which is a month later. And so I think it leads to better conversation. But that's a very good point, because she didn't recognize me when I got off the plane. Yeah, she was in the, oh yeah, she didn't. I had lost like 20 pounds. I was running a lot, just at like 6 miles every other night and everything, and eating very well. And so she was in the crowd where we marched out in formation, and apparently she had to lean over to the person next to me and said, do you see Ryan out there? And she's like, he's right there. He's right next to Mike. She's like, that's not Ryan. That's not. So, I mean, I think that the visual stuff probably, you know, that would have helped. I also took Polaroids. Like, I actually found disposable cameras. Trying to buy disposable cameras from Kuwaitis was very difficult because no one uses those. And then I had to send those pictures home to get developed, to then have them sent back to me, put them in the journal. And so those didn't even go directly to her. So having not seen me was a huge thing to get over. But I think I preferred our way, even though, you know, it feels good to be recognized still. But, you know, I'll sacrifice that for a journal. So.
Okay.
I think the letters would have been a better way to stay connected in a positive way. For me, technology created a burden. I felt like I was trying to manage home life while trying to be deployed. And I would take my frustrations out on the phone. You know, I'd have a hard day. I hadn't been asleep in over 24 hours, and I'm trying to make this last-minute phone call. So I had a short fuse, and then the phone would disconnect, and I'd have to call back. And so instead of enjoying the conversation, I was very stressed out and frustrated. And so I wasn't able to have like this poetic conversation like you would in a letter. You know, it was a lot more frustrating. So I think there was a lot more negative emotions when you're on the phone, just because there can be more stressors and you're able to verbally explain how frustrated you are, and you can just hear how tense your voice is. Versus with a letter, you can read a different tone.
I want to say that letters were nice. As I went back and reviewed for this series, I noticed that the emails got more and more stressful, going back and forth, and there were considerations taken and not taken on both sides, and the phone calls were just as scary, in the sense that, oh my God, what was that? And then there wouldn't be anything on the other line anymore. And there were a lot of times where they went dark, which is when something has happened to someone and they won't allow anyone to call home in fear of telling them before those two people with Class A show up at your door. So those times were especially scary. It, for me, got to a point where it was almost better to shut it completely down and act like it didn't, that it was just a weekend vacation versus, so letters were okay, but they were very far and few between for his particular job, which was infantry.
So, Dawn, I have a very specific question for you. You took us back in the segment that you're in to sort of the beginning of this sort of non-written communication. I mean, we went from letters to the telegraph, right? Do you see an arc there? Did it change the tone? I mean, that's what we're hearing, that the technology changes the tone. And you were seeing it, you can see it firsthand. And then we heard it. I mean, I found the tapes that Anthony had. I mean, first of all, it's amazing that they still played because they're 50 years old, right? Like, but do you see that in any of their archival material, that kind of shift in the way that people are talking about things?
I think it's very true that there was a shift in how people communicate and what you're able to say in a letter, to think about it, to write about it. There's so many differences between that kind of communication and what's happening today, as you were talking about email or Skyping or these other, what are supposed to be quick ways of communicating today. For archivists, they're a nightmare because we have to try to preserve them, and they're going to deteriorate, and it's hard to keep track of them. And how do you save all of these words that are flying around back and forth today? I always gravitate towards the earlier forms of communication. As a historian or archivist, I would rather hold that letter in my hand and think about what was that person's emotion at the time that they wrote it. What were they feeling? What were they going through? And then when you listen to the tapes in the film that were sent back and forth, it's definitely different. It's disjointed and it's rushed. It felt for me listening to it that they were rushed and it was hard for them to really have a heartfelt connection. So yeah, I think you're right. There's a shift that takes place with the technology and the changes in how we communicate and how personal it is or is not, depending on what the technology is.
I'm curious, the Army, or I mean in this case the Army because you're all Army vets, but the military is very specific about, at least what I've heard, about training you with everything. They teach you how to fold your clothes, they teach you how to wash yourself, they teach you how to take care of yourself. Did you get any training in how to communicate to your families?
Only from Courtney. No, I'm just playing. No, I think you get that from the people around you. I don't think there's any. I've never received any official training on how to communicate. It is available. I was always very close to my chaplains as well. I'm not very religious, but they come with a lot of wisdom that helped out tremendously. The best advice I ever got was from Chaplain Hunefeld when I told him I was getting married. He said, "It's never you versus her in an argument. It's you and her versus the situation at hand." And that's applicable across the board. And like that kind of stuff is, if you're wise enough to keep that kind of stuff, then, but I'm sure there's a regulation somewhere on how to communicate though. So
So kind of like what Ryan said, you kind of just go off what everybody else is doing, how they're communicating. Like this thing called a Magic Jack came relevant when I was on a deployment. So it's a phone that you can plug into your computer and you can set up like a landline. And so you have a stateside phone number and people can call and leave a voicemail. So it's interesting when it works. But the only thing I ever received from my chain of command is just watch what you say. Don't say any classified information, don't talk about the mission. So it doesn't leave you a lot to talk about. You're just sitting there like, so I drove a truck today. What'd you do? You don't have a whole lot of context behind it because you're afraid of what you may say and how it can come back to bite you. So that was the only thing I ever got officially. And then the people around me just decided to stop calling home because of the frustrations and trying to communicate with them. So I kind of followed suit a little bit with that because I realized it was harder to try to get in contact than it was to not.
I was going to agree. We were trained very well on what not to do and what not to say. Mm-hmm. And that was all. Oh, and to ensure that we called... we had to call home enough so that they didn't get a phone call about us. Yes. That was very clear. If we get a Red Cross message about you, you're in trouble. So let somebody know you're alive at the very least.
So there is some pressure to communicate, right? Mm-hmm. And Dawn, your presence here is just sort of telling us that there's always a need, right? They always want to talk. From boot camp, is that sort of where you learn how important this is to talk? Does it start right away in the military, do you think?
Oh, I have the mic. Cell phones weren't a thing when I went in. They weren't all huge and stuff, and so we couldn't have them. We only had pay phones. I remember those, and letters, and that's what we had when I was in basic. And so I wrote as often as I could, but I became too busy, and then everybody got attitude about that, but it worked out for me okay.
I agree, and I think they set the tone very differently in basic because, again, I didn't have cell phones either. I don't know, we old. So I didn't have a cell phone in basic either, so we wrote letters, and I wrote a letter every single day, and my husband wrote a letter every single day. And like I was saying in the film, sometimes I didn't get them one after another, but I could see the date and line them up and see where he was going with the conversation. And to me, I felt more connected through those letters than me calling him once a month from the payphone to let him know that I was alive and basic. So I do think they prepared you differently. So I expected that on the deployment, and it wasn't like that at all.
I'd say routine is the most important thing. Regardless of the form of communication, I think people are naturally inclined towards routine. And so if you're able to build on that, and I think that was one of the things that made it easier for us is because our routine was, stay busy at home, and occasionally, once a month or so, you'll get something in the mail. And I think that probably makes it the easiest. I think we had cell phones, but my plan didn't cover the Middle East, so we didn't really use them.
I want to wind up this part by just asking all of you, what new or additional thoughts do you have that you want to share with anybody that may watch this? And that includes active duty, veterans, people watching, people that have letters, people that have stuff that may be deteriorating. What does being involved in this conversation do for you or bring up for you that you want to share?
I think the message that I would want to send as someone who tries to collect and save these materials is that so often people think, well, what I have to say is not important. That letter I wrote home to my wife is not important to anybody else. And that has been true over many decades of people writing and communicating. They don't think what they have to say is important. And I would say, save that stuff. Save those letters. Save those tapes, because how else are the rest of us going to learn what was it like for you? What kind of an experience did you have? What can we learn from that? What can it teach us about how we communicate with everybody on a day-to-day basis when it was so difficult for people who served and were separated from their families. Those of us who didn't go through that, we have no idea. We can't begin to understand. But what you had to say to each other was really important, and we need to save that and share it with other people as time moves forward.
So I will expound on what she said and bring up veterans' voices and how you should tell your story. No. It is truly important. I think that my story, it didn't end well for me. I know that these two lovely couples still have wonderful marriages and stuff, but after 3 years of being apart on different deployments, it didn't work out. I mean, I have a beautiful daughter and we co-parent, and she is well loved. It's perception, and it's making that effort. I'm very happy for you guys that you guys were able to pull through. I don't think your deployments was as long as mine.
So Erica, before you hand off the mic, you've spoken to probably way over, maybe close to 100 veterans recently from all eras, World War II, post 9/11, Korea, Vietnam, Cold War. I am curious, Dawn is talking about people saving these things. Do you find that people are happy they saved the things when they come and finally sit down and share their oral history with you?
Oh, absolutely. It is my joy to share in their joy of seeing and hearing about their story, and then knowing that it is now preserved for their great-great-grandniece or grandchild, or, generations to come, and for civilians and for other military members to know that this is what a 9/11 because 9/11 vets, we're not a big deal anymore. Like, we're not as big a deal. Let me fix that. But Vietnam vets and then World War II vets are their numbers are declining quickly. So it's really great to be able to find out what their experience was like, and then still be able to relate to it. Like, oh, you sent a letter? I had to too. Can you believe it? I had a cell phone in my pocket. It never worked. So yeah, it's amazing, and sharing is so important to your heart, even if you don't realize that yet. Like, getting that off your chest, letting someone else know it's not only beneficial to you, but it's beneficial to them. And I go now.
I'll add that I do think it's important to preserve some memory or memento or whatever it is from your deployment or your military service, because during the time while I was deployed, I didn't take a single picture, not one. And I tried to keep myself very distant from both worlds, the military and my home life. I didn't want to be too in deep to either, so I didn't take pictures. I didn't get too sentimental about anything, and I deeply regret that now. I didn't document enough. I didn't write enough. I didn't say enough details, and now my memory is failing me on the details, and I really wish that I could show someone or show a letter or something to express how I felt in that moment, or what was going through my mind, or what it was actually like, or what it was like on my end, so that my family could understand why I was so distant or why I was the way I was. And so I think my advice would be to anyone who serves or supporting someone who serves or anything in that regard, to preserve the memory, because you may want it later. You can box it up and save it for when you're ready, but definitely preserve what you can.
Ryan, do you and Courtney want to end this sort of segment for us?
Yeah. One thing that really stood out to me watching that, and even just being a part of the process, is for all the people who are going through it right now, just be really patient. Just be really patient and stick with it, because it kind of stinks while it's happening, but I'll tell you, like, being part of all of this and going back and reading all those letters has been really fun and really rewarding. So
Ryan, the last word is yours.
Great. I agree. I think cutting your spouse as much slack as you possibly can, no matter if you're the soldier or the spouse, is huge, because you're doing stuff over there, she's gonna be home doing stuff too, like, you're both busy. And Don, to what you were saying before, I am a firm believer that we have a responsibility to future generations to bear witness to what happens in our lives and what's happening. That was one of the things that at the beginning of this episode, my dream for 15 years has been realized. It wasn't that I wanted to fight for my country or something like that. It was I wanted to bear witness. I wanted to see what we were doing, where we were. I wanted to be present. I think that's important.
Thank you. So we're going to end the segment where we're broadcasting. Thank you for anybody that has watched up until now, and thank you so much to our panelists.